The title of my presentation today is Why You Are Still Anxious and What No One Has Told You About Changing It. The reason, first of all, I'd like to start with why am I speaking about anxiety? And so it's really been over the last 6 years the number one biggest issue that people have come to me with, anxiety being the one issue that stands in the way of their success. And so let's look at it. I'll be taking a science-based view here for the next half an hour or so. I'll fill you in on the current state of the science around what anxiety is, the treatment options, and some stuff that nobody has ever told you about anxiety before. So let's get going. I want to start with with the basics so that we all have the same understanding. We all know what we're talking about when we're saying the word anxiety. So anxiety, by its nature, without the kind of thing that's bothering you yet, just the function of anxiety is a biological adaptive function. It prepares you to respond to what might become a threat. It's really part of our defense system, our emotional defense system. So when you're anxious, there will be stress hormones around, there will be adrenaline, cortisol for high alertness so that you are ready to respond in the way that's right. So this includes, if you think about everyday occurrences where that happens, for example, building up to this Facebook Live, there will be a certain little amount of an anxious feeling. You want to keep on your toes, you want to get everything right. And so in that it has a function. It prepares us for what's coming, keeps you on your toes, makes you get ready, have all systems switched on, essentially. So it's a little bit hyper aware. All your abilities are enhanced because the stress hormones are around, and that's not on its own a bad thing. It will be in its natural state situation dependent. So that means it comes when the challenge arises, and when you've mastered the challenge, it should settle down. That's anxiety in its natural state. But the type of anxiety that people have come to me with a lot is what I would call chronic anxiety. So if you are in the territory where you already have a diagnosis, it will be called a generalized anxiety disorder. But what it really describes is that all of those defense systems are constantly switched on. And that means there may be persistent or excessive worry, there may be fear around, and all of that doesn't subside when the stress subsides. It's not temporary, it's kind of always there. And you might find yourself waking up with it in the morning. It may lead to difficulties in decision making. It may impact your relationships, your functioning at school or work, whichever it is. It may disrupt your sleep. There's a back and forth relationship between anxiety and sleep. You may be worrying, ruminating all the time. You may even get physical symptoms. So what's known about that, some of the most common symptoms are headaches, stomach issues, muscle tension, being restless, being irritable, being constantly on edge. Sense of dread, a lot of my clients would have had that. Difficulty relaxing, where you're just not able to switch off. You're always in that heightened state, even during your time off. And it could also come out in ways that have a little bit more of a personality-like feel, and we'll be talking about those more in the future over the next few weeks. And what I'm talking about here is how it might come out in work, for example, that you may find you're actually over-functioning, over-preparing. You may be very perfectionistic about what you do. and ticking all the boxes may be your way of coping really with this anxious feeling. Or you may be overly accommodating towards other people. You may put other people first all the time, which is commonly called people pleasing. You may find yourself be really obsessed with work. Work might be your addiction, if you like. It may also come out in a way where you're overthinking. So you're ruminating about situations that have happened, going over and over them, reading stuff into what the other person may think about you, worrying about how they perceive you. And of course, we know that overthinking can create even more stress and more anxiety. We'll be looking at that in a moment. But let me break into the kind of treatment options, because for many people, their first stop, the first port of call is their doctor. And what does the doctor do but take out their prescription pad? So there's been a very popular theory around that says that anxiety is due to an imbalance of neurochemicals in your brain. Now, this is the interesting bit. That theory has actually been refuted. And even pharmaceutical companies at this stage have acknowledged that the chemical imbalance explanation just doesn't hold. It was mainly used for marketing, an easy way to make the public understand what's happening with anxiety. But in reality, the chemical imbalance that may be seen can be as much an output of anxiety as the cause. And scientists nowadays agree that it isn't the cause as such. It's something that's observed at the same time as anxiety sometimes, but it's not the cause. But nevertheless, your doctor will reach for the prescription pad first before they come up with any other alternative ideas, and that's basically because that's how they've been trained to work, and they lack a lot of the other insight that I'll be sharing with you here today and over the next few weeks. So what do they prescribe? They may prescribe SSRIs, which are really antidepressants, and they take a long time to work. Naturally, all of these medicines come with side effects as well. The SSRIs may or may not actually get to the symptoms you're experiencing. Same is true of the benzodiazepines. Let me try and pronounce that again. Benzodiazepines. So they're basically tranquilizers. So they're like in the same class as Valium, Mama's Little Helper. They will have effects on your driving. They will, of course, sedate you, and thereby they increase GABA and inhibit nerve signals. And that's what the calming effect is due to. But you cannot drive or shouldn't drive when you're taking them, and they just make you feel drowsy and so on. I have to say, I have never in all my time working in the trauma field either. There were many clients that I had who experienced anxiety as well as all the trauma symptoms. And I have personally never met anyone who said medication is it. That's the solution. Now I feel great. Now I no longer have a problem. Now this may be due to the fact that the people, maybe the people coming to me are already looking for other solutions. It could be that. But when I listen around, I haven't heard that either. So, they may or may not work is what I'm trying to say. I think medication has its place for an acute crisis that you need to manage. I'm not totally anti-medication or anything. I think you need to decide that together with your doctor. But what I've observed a lot is that when somebody is put on medication, that's kind of it, and the doctor doesn't review it with their patient. And I think that's definitely a difficulty. And people are on the stuff long term, where it doesn't actually, and that's known too, it doesn't solve the underlying problems. So it kind of keeps you going, but keeps you in limbo at the same time. Um, that's that's um, that's that about the medication part. Let's look a little bit at psychotherapy, because that's your next port of call. Your GP might say to you, I'll refer you to a psychotherapist. That's if they're good, you know. A lot of GPs don't think that way. Some nowadays do, the more progressive ones. But what happens in psychotherapy, and this is all stuff that I have seen myself, because I did work with talk therapy. For a short while I used talk therapy exclusively and then started doing other things. But still, talk was the main medium with which I worked. And when talk is all you have for an intervention, what you're relying on in terms of brain involvement is you're relying on the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain that helps you to think clearly in abstract ways, to solve problems. And the prefrontal cortex also has a role in regulating your emotions. When we rely on the prefrontal cortex in therapy, that's called top-down processing. And it means that we're using cognition to impact your emotional state. That's the end goal. So basically that you can tell yourself, well, I understand I'm having these feelings right now. They're anxious feelings, but the current situation doesn't warrant these feelings. So therefore, I'll make these feelings stop. Now, the problem with that, with anxiety, is that when you have a lot of anxiety, the prefrontal cortex and its connection to the rest of your brain, specifically the limbic system, which is responsible for generating anxiety, that connection can be weakened. And sometimes it can become switched off altogether, or almost switched off, which creates panic states that people can get into. And then the top-down processing cannot work when that connection is weakened. So that means you understand where your fears are coming from, but you just cannot change it. You can't do anything about it. And so this rule about top-down processing applies across the board of talk-based therapy. So whether it's CBT you're doing, or whether it's another form of talk therapy, like Gestalt therapy or eclectic psychotherapy, or another method that's popular, that rule will always apply. And you just cannot then solve it with talk alone. That's what I'm trying to say, because you're dealing with the limbic system, you're dealing with the amygdala, and the limbic system doesn't respond well to language on its own. We'll be coming back to that shortly. So then you may get some unhelpful responses. I want to address those too, because I've had clients who've been to therapists, and in the end, when it doesn't work, they may hear something unhelpful. They may hear that they're not treatable. I've had clients who had that remark, were exposed to that remark, which isn't exactly very encouraging. Or a therapist may say, try harder, or just follow the plan, or do the exercises, and you need to practice daily. But none of this is helping you, and you're still not getting there. So if that's the case, know that it's not about you. You're not doing anything wrong. And then you may hear from friends remarks like, don't worry about it, just think positive thoughts, just breathe. You need to push yourself out of your comfort zone. They're all well-meant remarks, but they're remarks by people who don't understand the territory. And so they can be very discouraging. I want to acknowledge that is definitely something that happens. So let's look at what anxiety really is, right? We've talked about chronic anxiety. What makes it so? So we've already said anxiety is part of your fight or flight response to situations that we perceive as threatening. Now this can be by degrees, threatening by degrees on a wide spectrum between mildly threatening or hugely threatening. But you have to keep in mind that our system only has the one mechanism. So that one mechanism of responding to threat will always kick in when there's a perceived threat. And every instance in which your system perceives a threat, your brain will try to protect you because that's its job. It's not that there's anything wrong with your brain. Your brain is doing what it's been tasked with, which is keeping you alive. And what happens then is what will be initiated are learning processes. Now, they're not ordinary learning processes like the type that you experience in a classroom. Rather, these learning processes are super fast. They happen in milliseconds. They happen often, or most of the time, I would imagine. I've sometimes noticed it in myself, but I'm clued in. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you may not even notice how these learning processes are kicking in. Your brain will immediately try to figure out, what do I have to do to get through the situation? What do I have to do to survive, essentially, is the question, even if it's not a survival issue in reality. So like public speaking, it can be very challenging. It can be people's biggest fear. But you will come down from that stage alive, whatever has happened. It's not actually a survival issue, but it feels that way. And so these learning processes, they have a name that you can Google. They're called long-term potentiation. This is a process that takes place in the amygdala and has a key role in forming and storing memories associated with threat or with fear. And this type of fear conditioning that the amygdala does is closely involved with these LTPs. So there have been, this is all scientifically based, right? So this has been shown in experiments. When you block LTP learning, then the amygdala won't have a fear response, right? So whatever experiments were done, this is a scientific fact. And when you induce LTP artificially, it creates similar changes that we see after somebody experiences a real fear. And so that's how we know how central LTP is to how the brain encodes anxiety. This is pretty much the latest state of the science, although neuroscience is evolving very fast. So primarily involved with this is the limbic system, but also the hippocampus. So there are different parts in your brain that play a different role. I just want to give you the terminology so that you're really well informed around it. So LTP, when you experience chronic anxiety, it's LTP that's at the core of it. And not just one incident, but there will typically be many, 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 many incidents that accumulate over time. It will have an accumulative effect. Your system, every time that LTP encoding happens, there's already another encoding there, and then there's another one and another one, and every time it happens, there's a certain amount of stress that comes with that. And now you can imagine your system has limited capacity for holding this kind of stress that is difficult to get rid of. So then you can develop an anxiety loop, right? When there's a lot of LTP encodings already in there. A small trigger. So that can be just a thought that you have, maybe just a feeling you wake up with in the morning that you're not even sure what to attribute to, but it feels like a bad feeling, or it can be just a small event, maybe something that's said to you, maybe worry about an upcoming event later on that day. Boom, anxiety gets activated. And then come your thoughts. So that was just the feeling, you know, so it started with the thought, then came the feeling. Now we're back to thoughts, and we're looking at negative thoughts, catastrophic thinking, potentially. God, what if I embarrass myself later on? So then what happens is the feeling in response to that thought becomes bigger. And now we're looking at dread, we're looking at worry. And there may be physical sensations too. So now we may be looking at a rapid heartbeat, maybe sweating, maybe muscle tension, or maybe a full-blown fight or flight response that's kicking in. Then you may interpret this fight or flight response, and there may be a heightened awareness as your physical sensations become more intense. Oh my God, my heart is racing, so something must be really wrong. And you really can go into deep emotional distress at that point. And this cycle can repeat, and it gets worse as your day goes on. And it can become very much a self-sustaining loop. So you can go through that cycle repeatedly throughout the day. As a result, many people develop avoidance behaviors. So that's where you kind of know your triggers and you try to avoid them. So there may be large parts of your life cut out. There may be, for someone maybe with social anxiety, they may cut out meetings with friends. They may isolate further and further. And we can see how avoidance has a price. It may bring you short-term relief, and for a while it may be necessary in managing anxiety, but it won't really deal with the problem, and there will be other triggers, and that LTP that's sitting underneath it will be triggered again. And you know, when you're avoiding too, you're building up more and more of a belief that the situation is dangerous, that maybe you're helpless in it, and so it can get worse over time, and it can become habitual. But so there are some things too that you can do, right? Let's move into this part of what you can do to improve your situation if anxiety plays a big role. So the very first one, and I do want to talk about it, I don't want to disregard it, is lifestyle. Because there are many lifestyle factors that trigger anxiety or make it worse, such as alcohol or recreational drugs, the very thing that you may be drawn to for relief. And we know that they don't really help matters. Again, that can only help in the short term, and then you're paying a price for that too. And good self-care is the foundation for everything that follows, right? So if you want to improve anxiety, that's an excellent place to start. It's what's in your control. You can make a start, changing your lifestyle or correcting the things that aren't working so well. Exercise, some people are very much drawn to it. Some really good findings here scientifically. It doesn't have to be aerobic exercise. It can be resistance training as well. And even everyday physical activity will reduce anxiety and boost mood. Diet, I spoke about that last week. If you eat a lot of, and this was just one aspect of diet, if you're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, you are much more likely, 53%, more likely. There was a big study that was published on CNN last week or the week before. So very, very recent. It was a large-scale study, and it showed there's a 53% increase in anxiety when you eat only 10% more ultra-processed foods. So that's one to look out for sure. Sleep, I already mentioned, there's a back and forth bidirectional relationship with anxiety and sleep. So do whatever you can to improve your sleep. 7 to 9 hours a night is what any adult needs. And if you can sleep well, you will reduce anxiety. And when it comes to mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and anxiety, they are helpful. Most people tolerate them very well. Results can vary. Some studies show that mindfulness can be as good as Lexapro in reducing anxiety. Lexapro is one of the major anxiety medications prescribed in recent years. Mindfulness, yoga, all of these things regulate stress hormones, heart rate, and breathing. They have a calming effect, so they definitely help things. Trains you to observe when you practice mindfulness, so that the idea being that you can begin to step outside being entirely consumed by these anxious feelings, that you can become an observer of your own experience and involve the prefrontal cortex to begin to make sense of what you're experiencing. So certainly useful, all of these things. They may not be a miracle cure. You can relapse even when you do all the right things, but you can build good coping skills, certainly with those, and in the long term it won't do any harm to do them. So again, a great place to start. Where do they fall short? Well, they're not a cure. Results vary widely, and you have to practice them regularly. That's the bottom line there. So how do you then, given that you have good self-care in place and you're doing all the right things, but you're still feeling anxious, how do you free yourself from that? And that comes down to down-regulating the chronic stress. So all these different LTP experiences that have been encoded in the amygdala, down-regulate all of that. And that means you have to communicate with the amygdala in a way that the amygdala understands. And you have to basically bring across the message that this situation or that situation is not an actual danger, and that these dangers are no longer relevant for your survival and shouldn't be encoded in that way. Now that's very easily said, but what language does the amygdala speak, and how do you communicate with it? We've already said that top-down approaches aren't very good at doing this. And so I've been working with bottom-up approaches for over 25 years now. And bottom-up means we use the body or the senses to communicate with the psyche, to impact the psyche. So in the last few years, I've been working with psychosensory approaches. These are very effective at communicating with the limbic system. So in that class of modalities belong EMDR, EFT, other tapping techniques, havening techniques belong in that category. And these things are maybe touch-based, maybe eye movement-based. And when we work through these senses, we can bring information across to the amygdala, because interacting with these senses will cause an immediate release of very beneficial neurochemicals, create a calming environment, you feel safe, you feel more settled immediately. And then I run processes through the back door that's been created that help to undo the LTP encodings. I'm planning to run challenges in this group, and so when you take part in a challenge, you will get to meet these techniques and you will get to solve an issue or two working with me in those challenges. So you will get a good feel for how I work and for how to change things too. So why does this work so well? Well, so here's the thing that really hasn't sunk in yet in medicine and how medicine is practiced. Even though it's scientifically very much supported as a concept, and that is that we are a unit of mind and body. The mind doesn't stand alone, and neither does the body stand alone. They are integrally connected, the mind and the body, and both are directly linked to the brain. So working through the senses will have a direct connection to the limbic system, and the reason for that is that the limbic system is about survival, and the emotions and the senses are very much part of our survival system. So it's not just about using the right type of technique, though. It's also about what you do with the right type of technique. So, for example, you have to be able to identify the chronic stress, exactly where it's coming from, before you can undo it. But it's a very gentle way of working, and that's in contrast to working with talk therapy, which can be rough. I'll say that openly. It can be like stirring a pot that's on the cooker, stirring it, bringing it to the boil. Then the session is over. You're putting the lid on because you haven't done anything with the feelings that have been activated, and the flame is still going underneath. So it can trigger a lot, and that's where the experience comes from that people can have in talk therapy, that it didn't really help, didn't help matters. Some even say it made matters worse. And that's what we very much want to avoid. I'm very careful when I work with these psychosensory techniques to be as gentle as possible. And that can be done. At this day and age, that can be done. And when you work that way, another thing to understand about it is it's not just about coping better. It's not about just learning better coping skills. So what my whole approach is about making you free, optimizing your personality for success, so that you come away from this feeling so much better, feeling like a different person, feeling like the you were always meant to be. That is my ambition, and that's what happens. So yeah, and so let's look at, what's a typical source of this chronic stress. The one I work with most often, and again, so this is largely from my experience, but there is science behind this too. I call it faulty childhood programming. These are threatening events from childhood. So when you really think about it, childhood is a time where we are very delicate. We have an immature brain at that point. We are fully dependent on the adults that take care of us. We couldn't possibly fend for ourselves. So there's a lot of potential here for something to go wrong and raise a threat. So if those adults are emotionally immature, or if something happens, maybe that's even outside of their control, and something happens in school, like school bullying, that would be a story I hear about a lot. That will become encoded and will have a long-term impact if the right support, certainly if the right supports aren't in place. Yeah, and so that results in this faulty childhood programming, right? So the area where there's science behind it is in what's called ACEs. So the ACE study, which is adverse childhood experiences. That's something that you can Google as well. But the ACEs only cover certain areas. They cover more what would be obvious trauma flags. So where you instantly know, well, that was traumatic, like an abusive situation, like if a parent is an addict, so we know about those. But faulty childhood programming can be much, much more subtle too. So this type of conditioning where you download the wrong thing can be due to maybe your parents trying their best, but just not quite being able to meet you and meet your developmental needs all the time. That can happen. And so faulty childhood programming, that concept covers a lot more than ACEs, is what I'm trying to say. It's much, much broader, and you will get to meet more about that in the next few weeks. Now, the thing is, it can seriously obstruct you when you're an adult and you're trying to live your adult life in an adult way, but it's a bit like you're wearing child-sized shoes, or wearing child-sized shoes in some ways when you have faulty childhood programming sitting in there. There can be limiting beliefs, there can be difficult emotions, there can be low esteem, low self-love, there can be anxiety, we've already talked about that. And what can be very difficult is even putting two and two together. Because when you've always felt this way and it feels so familiar, then it's very easy for people to assume that's personality and that they cannot actually change that. Oh, that's just me. And that's where the name of the group comes from. Optimize your personality for success. You can change these things. You can change many things that you believe are personality can be optimized. So when I started with psychosensory work, I want to share this experience with you because that illustrates the power of this work. I cleared a mountain of chronic fear that I didn't even know I had. And it was only when that fear left my system that I realized that that fear had been there. Now, I was quite content at the time, but I noticed major changes afterwards. A lot changed, especially professionally afterwards. And so that illustrates how even when you don't know where this is coming from, or even if you don't know exactly what it is, but if there's something, if you perceive a block, then there's likely to be something somewhere due to, most likely in 90% of cases, it will be faulty childhood programming, especially if you don't have a memory associated with it. And I can help you find it and undo it. And you optimize your personality, and that means clearing the layers upon layers of chronic stress to reveal that you were meant to be by design. So let's recap. We're over the 30 minutes. So what you've learned from me today is what anxiety really is. It's the result of chronic stress. It's called by LTP incidents, probably over many years, probably many of them probably due to some extent at least to faulty childhood programming. You've also learned that self-care is the foundation for all else that follows, and you've learned what to look out for. Nutrition, exercise, sleep primarily. There are other things, but those are very important as a foundation. I introduced you to psychosensory techniques and why they work so well and why I include them heavily in my work. Faulty childhood programming will be an issue over the next few weeks in my presentations, in probably more than one live, and I will see you then, and already looking forward to next week. It's been lovely to have you here, and that's where I say goodbye. See you next week.